Hello there and welcome to the Pint-Sized Healing Podcast. My name is Max Thompson. Let's get started. So today I am joined by Bob on the podcast, and Bob is none other than my very own mindfulness teacher. Well, not just mine, but I am included in his alumni list of alumni. And Bob, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit further?
Thanks, Max. Yeah, and I am here just for you, of course, absolutely. There's no one else. Sure. So I'm a private practice counsellor based in the UK, county of Suffolk. I do operate online around the world as well. Cornerstones of my practice are around trauma resolution, some psycho-therapeutic processes, mindfulness to help facilitate CBT. So that's kind of me. Actually, a little bit more background on that. Mindfulness came to me during the biggest crises in my life, I think. And 47 years of struggle began to come to an end as a result of finding mindfulness and the gaps and the conduits that produced. So that's why I'm an advocate of mindfulness.
Yeah, because I don't think any of us really come to this trauma healing story without having our own experiences. At least the people I meet in this line of work. We have obviously worked together on the on your mindfulness course that I have, like I mentioned, that I'm an alumni of, and so maybe it's a good idea to just really quickly take us through the cornerstones of what mindfulness is.
Yeah, it's great. I'd love to do that. So yeah, the online mindfulness program that you attended and that's open to anybody in the world really is for beginners and moderate users, I suppose, of mindfulness practice. It's a good reminder if you're already practicing about the backgrounds and the cornerstones of the practice, but it's great as a beginner as well. So I'll not go into great detail. I'll just touch on the sort of order of play for a more science-based mindfulness practice. Of course, mindfulness comes from Buddhist practice and is reckoned to be over 2,500 years old, potentially more. But the practice, as ever, is as relevant today and probably more so than ever. It doesn't really have a necessary religious association or affiliation, though you can be. I just happen to be fortunate to look like a Buddha. I'm actually not. So, the very first beginnings of practicing mindfulness is about maintaining attention, growing your attention and concentration. And why is that important? Because without having attention for what I'm thinking and feeling and my environment, I can't find clarity about what it is that's happening. Is it someone else's behavior that's affecting me, or what I think about their behavior? And asking philosophical sort of questions along that. But if I'm not aware as a result of my attention, then how can I know what I want to change? If I find myself going to the biscuit tin just because my family's gone out for a walk and I've just eaten beforehand, then there's a good chance that I'm incorrectly cognizing something from my past, and for me that would be abandonment. So automaticity is the next thing after attention. And automaticity is all about 80% of our day is our waking day.
Yeah.
Is actually very much asleep. We're sleepwalking around just doing the things we know how to do without thinking about it. So that's an area where we're able to be hijacked by emotions and thoughts, ruminations of the future and regrets of the past, etc.
Exactly.
So it's a big one around automatic behaviour. We're gifted to be able to know how to brush our teeth, if you've got hair to brush it, and so on and so forth. However, they are the times when we really must bring our senses into play and make it what we call in Buddhist terms, beginner's eye. So when I'm brushing my teeth, I'm looking at the colour of the toothpaste. I'm really taking everything in, the feel of the toothbrush, the noise of the bristles, the taste, if there's any smell to it. The whole experience becomes a new experience. And while I'm doing that, I can't be anywhere else. So that's just one very quick example of automaticity being turned into a mindful practice. We can do it through eating, driving, walking, talking, dressing. There's every aspect of our life that we do automatically, we can turn into a more mindful moment if we wish to. And that becomes useful if we're becoming anxious or low or affected deeply emotionally.
Yeah.
And we don't require that at this time. You know, we might be in the middle of a meeting or something like that. So we can choose to bring ourselves back to this moment, become more grounded and centered. The next one is around judgment. And I find this personality trait, if you will, one of the most enduring, and particularly with this kind of audience, I think, where any of us have suffered from childhood emotional neglect and abuse or other, we're more likely to be quite fearful and then angry and very judgmental of others and situations. And I think the more judgmental we are about others and situations, the more judgmental it tends to reflect back on ourselves. And so it's a really important but enduring one. I think of all the traits that I've been working on since I was 47, judgment is the toughest, because we necessarily need judgment, of course, you know, to keep us safe and to inform us about the world. But doing that negatively, we must see both sides.
Yeah, and I think as survivors, we do it from a skewed perspective of the world, right? So we're judging against a system that is an incorrect system.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at contrast. I mean, what's on the front of the magazine compared to, you know, in the advertising media, etc., compared to what we have. So that can make us judge that we're not enough, or we don't have enough unless we have the next model of car, or the certain size house with a swimming pool, or the certain wife or husband, and so on and so forth. So judgment is a huge, huge subject. But with mindfulness, we can do it, you know, in small bites. We can catch ourselves through the day, whether we're being kind, whether we're looking at both sides of a coin in terms of judgment. And then another massive one, I think they're all massive really, but acceptance. And in trauma and healing, I think acceptance is a real swear word at the beginning until people are at a certain point. And it's for no one else, of course, to introduce acceptance to yourself, or to inquire that, or suggest and invite you to find acceptance. It's personal to every individual, of course.
I think acceptance and forgiveness in that sense for trauma recovery go hand in hand.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, acceptance branches out into, as you say, forgiveness and compassion.
Yep.
And figuring out how keeping something alive that was done to us, about us, serves us, and whether it does and whether it continues to. And that's a huge subject, of course, so not probably for now. Next one is one that's probably less powerful for this audience quite often, but it's about goals, and we all have goals, of course. But is the goal just to feel a different way? Will it be all right when? I think that's a dangerous game that I certainly played for 47 years, I can recall. We climb a mountain, we think it'll be all right when I get to the top of that mountain, and then we look over it and it's see, as we're exhausted, the next mountain.
Next mountain.
Yeah, and this is this instant gratification that we can self-soothe with at times and believe that things will be okay when we get to these goals.
Once we get to the next bit, yeah.
And the problem is, if we're focused too hard on the goals, we miss the journey to the goal, of course. The irony is with mindful practice, I think you find, is that when you learn how to goal orientate in a better way, it almost doesn't matter. You just innately know what you want and you go towards that in a kind way without defining yourself by the outcomes. But that's a very brief take on that one.
This is very it's very funny that we mentioned this, because I'm like, oh, that's right, I need to go back to the course and double check this part again, because I'm in one of these goal setting predicaments.
Yeah, and of course it can leave us feeling that we're not achieving something, you know, when actually every day at every moment we're achieving something. There was a good analogy that somebody wrote once, saying that if you imagine life and ourselves being on a large coil, okay, and we're sitting on this piece of this coil, and every day we're higher up the coil and we're looking down at previous experiences, but often when we feel anxious or low, we can say, oh, I'm back there again. You're not. You're higher up. You're at a new place of learning.
Well, and I also always say, like, even if you, like, say you've experienced abuse from someone, and you know, a partner that you were with for 10 years, and then you get into a new relationship that also turns out to be manipulative or toxic, but it only takes you 2 months to recognize that behavior, then, I mean, that is a big learning curve. That is great, right? That's a result.
Very good. Very good.
10 years this time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so common in the therapy room here that somebody will say to me, yeah, I knew that, you know, the flags came out when I met this person, and yet I ignored them. But even knowing that is learning.
Exactly.
I'm more aware now because I've recognized that I made a mistake again, or I didn't listen to my intuition or whatever. So,
well, and it teaches you that your intuition might be worth listening to the next time.
Indeed, and that's a compassionate view that we can have for ourselves instead of actually kicking ourselves when we get it wrong. The last thing we need when we make a mistake is to then beat ourselves up about that. That's not really healthy. We just need to treat ourselves as we would treat a small child who's made a mistake. And that is not to kick them around all over the place, but to actually bring them closer and let them know how they might be able to operate in a different way and that they're good enough regardless.
But we tend to be Miss Trenchbull to ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Put ourselves lock ourselves in a cabinet somewhere and punish ourselves greatly for the smallest mistakes that we make. But
we've been taught that well, haven't we? I mean,
yes, very well.
Yeah. So mindfulness allows us to have attention for that, to look at that and observe, become the observer of that narrative that we can cripple ourselves with. So that's the double dart syndrome. The first dart is when we make a mistake and get hurt. The second dart is what we make of that and attack ourselves again for making that mistake. We don't need to do that. So compassion for others as well as ourselves, and that, as we touched on earlier, sort of goes into the forgiveness aspect. Why would I forgive? Well, because you're carrying the toxicity, expecting someone else to die as a result of it.
Well, that's the thing, I don't think forgiveness is about the other person. It's all about yourself.
Absolutely.
Carrying stuff around with us is it's exhausting.
It is. I use the analogy of carrying a huge black sack around behind us, and all the bricks in it are our experiences, our negative experiences. Why don't we start unloading them and leaving them behind? We know what we know. We let go of so much other stuff. We hold on to stuff, I think, because it doesn't feel safe to let go. We don't trust ourselves to remember, but we'll remember. And often,
yes,
of course. The most complicated one, I think, is the ego. That's in week 7 of my course. And being able to separate ourselves from the ego, and that's a massive challenge, I think. The ego, of course, always wants more, and goes back to the it'll be all right when, if I could just get this next hit, and if I draw lots of contrasts and so on. But we're not our experiences. The ego is a construct of all our experiences, conditioning, teachings, and negative behaviors. But it's not us. We're not our past. We're not even our thoughts, and we can have thoughts, but we don't believe them all the time, depending on what they are. And then in week 8, it's about integrating all those things, the automaticity, the attention, the judgment, the acceptance, the goals, the ego, and compassion, and learning how to build that into your life. And it's in some ways, it's a very lonely but deliberately self-centered, compassionate act, to act mindfully, to be mindful, to be present here now, rather than all those reminders that are waiting for us when we're on autopilot.
And I think, and especially when you have a traumatic past, it's so easy to live in that past, or to live in all the possible things that could be going wrong tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And I always say, stop building bridges for rivers that you might never have to cross, right? Because you're carrying those things around with you, and they're heavy because they're bridges.
And it's exhausting.
Right. And 9 out of 10 times when you get to a river, there's other people there that will help you build the bridge.
That's a really great analogy. I think, we can have 10 events happen through the day that we can recall at the end of the day as we're going to sleep, which I think is a great practice, by the way, if we do it non-judgmentally. But we'll forget the 9 good things, of course, and we'll remember the bad thing. And that's by design, by evolutionary practice. If we didn't remember something that was potentially negative, it would be life-threatening for us, or we could be cast aside from the tribe, or we could be attacked by another tribe, or a predator, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Or the lion will eat us,
But of course, in today's world, that's so ambiguous, so many different calls for our attention, so many people acting in divisive ways quite often. We have to be able to individuate ourselves and understand where this person's coming from that would appear to be hurting me. If it's in terms of words and actions for somebody who's a colleague or something like that, rather than family member.
Well, and I think as well that, especially once you've experienced, abuse or neglect in a setting, like say by, parental or spousal, then you may see some of that behavior in someone that you're working with, but it's not so much an issue because those people, you maybe see them 5 minutes a week.
I think that's true, but you're also in a different persona then, aren't you? You're the colleague.
Exactly.
You're
Yes,
the
exactly. You have a completely different, there's a different power play, right?
yeah,
Between you
yeah,
and a colleague. The more power someone has in your life, the greater their influence, right? So a manager will have more influence than a coworker most of the time.
yeah.
Because they have more power over you, and that's, at the end of the day, abuse is just about power anyway, and control.
It is, and the more abusive and offensive people are, the more frightened they are and insecure they are, of course. But I think the only caveat to what you're just saying there in the workplace, for instance, is if somebody should remind you, not just by their actions and their words, but maybe literally, physically remind you, or their words, or their mouth, or their, the way they speak might remind you of someone that was abusive in your past. And that's a challenge. I mean, that's a great opportunity for learning to
Exactly.
separate from what was the past and what is today.
And I think where mindfulness has been very helpful for me is that you because you're more aware of what's going on in the moment, it makes you more aware of where your triggers are. And I always say you have to embrace your triggers, because those are, as annoying as they are also the navigation of what you're doing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They are how you figure out where you need to heal. So once you see them, head for those babies and deal with them, right?
This is, as it was said in Buddhism, suffering teaches us. It comes to teach us. And we wouldn't hand somebody a load of suffering. Here, go and learn from this. But
yeah,
the suffering we've had and we've been given without being invited to receive it, that can teach us so much. Again, if we have that kind of equanimity of thought around the meaning of abuse and neglect and suffering for ourselves, we can remove ourselves, we can become that observer again, and we can figure out what it can mean for us. How can I grow from this? How can this be, what can I take that's positive out of this?
Yeah.
And I think everybody's neglect, abuse and trauma is individual to them, of course. There's no competition. For me, I've been blessed to be able to come to terms with, I believe, you never quite know, with just about everything that's I've been involved with. And I can find the gift in pretty much everything. And it's not just positive, happy, clappy thinking.
No, but it's not like, I think that stuff is not about pushing down, just in general, positive thinking shouldn't be about pushing down the more complicated stuff. It means working through the more complicated stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And week one after you've escaped an abuser, you're not going to be thinking about the positive lessons that abuse has brought to your life.
No, this is much nearer the term of acceptance, isn't it?
Exactly. And honestly, and that's totally fine, right? Like you're not, and when I say you're not there yet, I don't mean, oh, that sounds super patronizing, but I don't mean it in that way at all. Like, we need to go through the whole process of healing.
Of course.
And sometimes it can be quite complicated to be okay with where we're at, while at the same time feeling that drive to move forward, feeling that invitation to our, extending the invitation to ourselves to improve our lives, while simultaneously being okay with where we are.
Yeah, and there's that observer, that's standing outside of ourselves again. I think that touches on an area that I didn't sort of explain in my background or my introduction, and childhood emotional neglect. And it's another passion of mine and another cornerstone of my work here in the therapy room. Because, of course, the child that we were in the first 10 years or so is going to be the adult that we're going to become to some degree. All our experiences after the age of 10 are going to be based on the shaky foundations or a solid foundation, depending on what we've got. I meet very few people with a solid foundation. I think that the beauty of the work that I do in sort of terms of trauma resolution and childhood emotional neglect is that we can reparent ourselves. We can heal from the traumas. To a large degree, we can make ourselves responsible, become responsible for healing from the traumas and reducing the meaning, but never forgetting the messages, of course. And reparenting ourselves so that when we feel the pain, like the analogy I used earlier, we can go to the child in us and offer him or her love, compassion, acceptance, attention, unconditionally. And that really is a powerful job. I think that inner child and reconciliation of the inner child, whether you subscribe to it or not, you can call it the emotional brain, if you will. is incredibly powerful work. Tears, tissues are required.
Yes.
With that work.
I think in general, just, as we get away from abuse, there's going to be a couple of boxes of tissues that we are going to have to use at some point. Just saying. But it's funny because, like you say, you can become the observer. And one of the examples I often use as well when it comes to setting boundaries is that our tendency to over justify why we're saying no to something.
Yeah.
And so listen, I still do this from time to time, and I think every human being sometimes over explains themselves, because we're tired or whatever. But I used to do it all the time, and I would say like, oh, do you want to have, I would say to my husband like, oh, do you want this for dinner? And he'd go, no, I'd rather have whatever, pasta. And I'd go, well, we're going for Italian tomorrow. And, and I'd go into this whole big long 15-minute explanation as to why I didn't want to have pasta, instead of just saying, nah, don't feel like it, right? Which is really it's not even that. It's not even an important choice, really, in a day, right? Like, are we having pasta or rice?
I think that comes out classically, and people say, "What would you like?" And it's, I don't care. You choose.
You choose. Yeah, exactly.
I am so guilty of that. I am so guilty of that.
And then saying no to every single suggestion.
Yeah. But then you think, I've got this horrible meal that we didn't really want.
Yeah.
Where do you want to go for dinner? I don't care.
But it's so funny when you go into that kind of over justifying. Oh, and it took me a little while and some nudges from Stuart as well. But at some point you hear yourself going into that kind of mindset where you're like, it's almost like you're justifying your existence, your right to have an opinion about what you want to eat tonight. And just because you're more aware of, and it's not just you're more aware of that's the behavior that you're displaying, but I think it expands into being more aware of, oh, what are the situations when I'm doing that, right? Because you start to be aware of, maybe maybe you do it more when you are hungry, or maybe you do it more, when, I don't know, a certain event happens on that day, right? So if you always have a meeting with your manager on a Thursday, and it always happens on a Thursday, right? So you start to kind of recognize these patterns because you become more aware of where you're at.
Very good, very good. Absolutely right. Yeah. Without that awareness, we can't know. We just continue having the same problems, the same day, the same week, month after month, year after year. You're absolutely right. That's a very good explanation. Very good.